Welcome back to the Deep Dive. The sources you've shared this week, they really drop us right into one of the most volatile debates happening in Australia right now.
They really do.
We're looking at a whole stack of material, but it's all centered on this conversation with two Christian preachers, Martin and Millicent Cedra. They're Coptic immigrants, originally from Egypt.
That's right. And this is a really powerful, highly personal testimony that the Cedras then use to build a much broader political and theological argument.
Okay.
So our mission today is really to analyze the mechanics of that argument. I mean, how do they bridge their own experiences with religious perception to this sweeping claim that the ideology of Islam is, fundamentally incompatible with Western civilization?
Especially when it comes to things like governance and freedom.
Exactly.
And the whole thing is kicked off by an event that hits incredibly close to home for them.
The recent terrorist attack at Bondi Beach.
Yeah, which happened just, 40 minutes from where they lived? And they flew out of Australia shortly after it happened.
Right. They frame that violence as the ultimate proof that their warnings about this cultural conflict aren't just theoretical anymore, they're immediate.
It's a tragic, really visceral starting point.
Right.
So let's begin there, with the foundation of their worldview, which is Martin Cedra's life back in Egypt.
To really get their fear now, you have to go back. Martin, in the sources, he looks back 1,400 years.
Oh.
He points out that Egypt was something like 90% Christian before the Islamic conquest, and today Christians are only about 10% of the population. His family was part of that minority.
And his father wasn't just, a passive Christian. He was an active preacher.
A very active preacher. His main ministry was focused on converting Muslims.
Which the Cedras describe as, I think the word they used was suicide.
Basically, yeah. Under their interpretation of Sharia apostasy laws. And we should probably clarify what Sharia law means in this context.
Good idea.
It's the Islamic legal framework, right? And in its strictest forms, it can demand death for any Muslim who chooses to leave the faith. So the stakes for his father were profound.
And there was a crisis point, a specific event.
A huge one. A Muslim woman converted to Christianity after hearing Martin's father preach. The problem was, her husband was a leader in a known Muslim terrorist group.
Oh, wow.
And when he found out, his vengeance wasn't aimed at the preacher, it was aimed at his children.
The sources recount this planned attempt to kidnap Martin's two younger brothers. They were only 9 and 5 years old.
Just kids. And the goal wasn't just kidnapping. The plan, as the Cedras tell it, was to behead the boys and then deliver their heads to the father.
To teach him a lesson. I mean, it's just horrific.
It is, and this is where the source material pivots to what they call a miracle.
Right.
The terrorist leader sent his men, but they failed. The Cedras report that on the first attempt, the men felt physically frozen. They literally couldn't move until the school bus had already left.
And they tried again.
They tried again the next day, with even more men. But as they reached for the boys, the attackers claimed they felt a supernatural hand, some kind of angel that physically tied their arms behind their backs until the kids were safe.
And the outcome of all this is pretty stunning.
It is. The terrorist leader himself eventually came to the Cedra family's house, confessed the whole plot, and just said, "Your God protected them."
And then he converted.
He converted to Christianity and was baptized. But the family is quick to point out, while this story is miraculous, the fear, the persecution in Egypt, that's very common.
That context of just living under constant threat, that's so important for understanding why they moved.
Absolutely. They said Coptic Christians go to church literally knowing there might be a bombing. And aspiring pastors get taught one lesson, basically. If you preach, don't fear. If you fear, don't preach.
And to really drive home that fear, Martin talked about a specific tradition.
The cross tattoo?
Yeah, that Christian children in Egypt often get a cross tattooed on their wrist when they're just 1 year old.
It's an indelible mark, a desperate measure, really. They do it so if the child is ever kidnapped and raised in a Muslim family, that cross is a permanent sign of their Christian identity.
The Cedras added that kidnappers often just try to burn the mark off.
It's this historical trauma, this daily reality that completely shapes their reaction to what's happening now in Australia.
Okay, so that foundation of fear is critical. Let's make that transition now to the immediate issue. The Bondi Beach attack, which, as the sources note, happened near their home during Hanukkah.
Right. The reported facts are a 24-year-old and his 50-year-old father killed 16 people. The victims ranged in age from 10 to 87, and they hospitalized another 42.
And in the perpetrator's car, police found explosives and 2 ISIS flags.
which the Cedras immediately linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. They also pointed out he'd studied the Quran at the Medina Death Center in Sydney.
And this is where we have to really focus on their interpretation of the motive. They are adamant that this attacker wasn't some outlier, not a radical Muslim.
No, in their view, he was a faithful Muslim.
And it's so important to note that they base this on a very specific, and I would say extreme, reading of the Quran.
Absolutely. They claim the text commands him to kill the infidel, specifically citing Jews, and to behead non-believers, which would include Christians. Now, this is a fundamentalist interpretation, and it's one that many, many mainstream Muslim scholars would strongly reject.
Of course. But for the Cedras, this belief is the core reason for the violence. It's the whole mechanism.
They also questioned his training. They noted reports that he was an excellent shooter and that he'd allegedly trained in the Philippines.
Which suggests to them, I suppose, a more organized effort.
Exactly. Not just some spontaneous act. And this systematic view leads them straight to their critique of the official response in Australia.
Well, there's the story of the hero, right? A Muslim man was celebrated for stopping the attack.
He was. But the Cedras assert that a segment of the broader Muslim community is calling that hero a traitor.
And that's a powerful claim. It connects right back to their theological argument.
It does. They're arguing this alleged reaction shows that Western ideas of heroism are just incompatible with the ideology they believe is at play. And we should be clear, we are reporting on their assertion here. This likely represents a radical segment, not a consensus.
Right. Their criticism then moves up to the political level, to the Australian government.
They really tear into the government's handling of it. They quote the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, warning about anti-Semitism and right-wing extremist groups.
Then they argue he's still too afraid to actually talk about the religious ideology behind the attack itself.
Right, and they back this up by citing past events. They claim the PM allowed Muslims to shout "Gas the Jews" in front of the Opera House 2 years ago.
An event they claim led to a Jewish person being jailed.
They say it plainly. They say the blood of the Bondi victims is on his hands, and that is a direct quote from the material. It's a very specific, very partisan political attack.
And this perceived inaction, combined with new laws, is what they say drove them out of the country.
Yes. They report the PM is introducing 5 new reforms, and they fear these laws will lead to jail time for preachers who speak against the ideology of Islam.
Labeling it hate speech.
Exactly. And they highlight one law that's already passed, the Conversion Practices Ban Act from April 2023.
Now, legislation like this is usually aimed at preventing coercive conversion therapy, specifically around sexual orientation or gender identity.
It is. But the Cedars argue the language is so broad, it criminalizes basic religious practice. They claim under this law, a parent just praying for their child to be set free from homosexuality could face up to 5 years in prison.
So their fear is that the government is censoring Christian preaching while ignoring, in their view, imams who preach hate.
That's the core of it.
Let's widen the lens now and look at the broader societal issues they raised, starting with self-defense, or the lack of it, after Bondi.
They really lament Australia's gun laws. I mean, they were put in place after the Port Arthur massacre in '96, and they severely restricted private gun ownership.
Their point being that when an armed attacker shows up, citizens are completely vulnerable.
Totally. They pointed out that it's illegal to carry any defense weapon, not even pepper spray or a knife. Legally, you have to rely on a heavy umbrella or martial arts.
They believe this has basically set the country up for successful terror attacks. But they see an even bigger problem.
Immigration?
The rate of immigration, yeah.
Yeah.
Australia has a population of 27 million, and they're allowing 250,000 to 300,000 immigrants a year.
And many are coming from the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan. Now, Martin is very clear here. He's an immigrant himself. He assimilated.
Right.
He argues the problem isn't immigration itself. It's allowing in people who, as he puts it, hate the country and burn the flag. He says it's stopped being immigration and is now an invasion.
That's a very strong word.
It is, and it brings us right back to that idea of ideological incompatibility. They actually reference an American politician, Randy Fine, and his extreme call for a Muslim travel ban.
And they align with that.
They're cautious about the politics of it, but they fully align with the core idea that Islam, as an ideology, is incompatible with the West.
How do they define that incompatibility?
They contrast the two systems. The Western cornerstone of freedom of religion, of speech, is just fundamentally opposed to Sharia law, in their view. They use this stark analogy from the historian Raymond Ibrahim.
I remember this one.
Muslim immigration, it's like bringing a lion and putting him in a cage with lambs.
And they list some of the harsh details of Sharia law they claim immigrants are demanding.
Yeah, that apostates, people who leave Islam, are killed, that homosexuals are thrown off buildings, that husbands are allowed to beat their wives.
And that even critiquing the Prophet Muhammad is a death sentence.
Right. And this is a major point of conflict for them. They explicitly call out Western feminists who support Sharia law as walking contradictions, arguing the oppression of women is just undeniable.
But treatment of women under Islam was a really central part of their argument.
It was a pillar of it. The sources detail the contrast. They state that under Islam, a man can beat his wife, and you need 4 male witnesses to prove rape.
Which they claim often just leads to the woman being charged with adultery instead.
Exactly. And they connect this to real-world examples like the Taliban laws in Afghanistan from 2023, where women were banned from singing or even laughing loudly in public because their voice might tempt a man.
And they argue this is rooted in the theology itself.
Yes, they claim the Quran calls non-Muslims apes and pigs. They argue that by dehumanizing the infidel, things like violence and even non-Muslim sex slaves become easier to justify.
And this is all set in contrast to the Christian doctrine of Imago Dei, the image of God.
Where women are honored, and where Jesus' teachings blame the man for his own lusts, not the woman for being a temptation.
It all builds to their final comparison.
Yeah.
Jesus versus Muhammad.
This is presented as the ultimate ethical split. They list Muhammad's actions as, killing the infidel, cursing Jews and Christians, starting 84 wars, having 11 wives.
And marrying Aisha when she was 6.
And consummating the marriage at 9. Then they contrast that with Jesus, loving his enemies, forgiving them, starting no wars, honoring women, and protecting children.
They conclude all this with a big cultural warning. They tie their religious beliefs directly to global trends.
They do. They argue that the West's move towards secularism has created a moral vacuum. They cite Australia's shift from 96% Christian in 1940 to just 40% today.
And they believe that void is exactly what Islam is ready to fill.
Right. They point to things like the cancellation of New Year's Eve events in Paris and Tokyo for safety reasons as evidence that societal trust is just collapsing along with faith.
So we have these two expansive ideologies clashing. The Cedras are basically framing this as a demographic and spiritual choice for the West.
That's a great way to put it. They define Christianity as expansive through evangelism and discipleship. It wants to change minds. Islam, in their view, is expansive through Sharia law and conquest.
And they introduce one final threat, what they call the jihad of babies.
This is the demographic argument. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, and the Cedras argue it's primarily through procreation. They even quote an imam who said Islam will conquer the West through the womb of the woman.
They lay out a really grim contrast in birth rates.
They do. They claim Muslim families often have 4 or 5 kids, maybe up to 20 if a man has 4 wives. Meanwhile, they say the West is committing demographic suicide.
Through 3 things, specifically.
Right. Abortion, feminism telling women to choose career over children, and LGBTQ plus ideology noting that Adam and Steve can't have babies. So the Western population isn't even replacing itself.
This demographic reality, for them, means the West is just losing the battle on cultural values and birth rates alone.
Exactly. They end by framing this whole analysis as the fundamental choice you have to make. Stick with a moral standard rooted in Christianity, or accept the rise of what they see as incompatible secularism or Sharia law.
So, if, as the Cedras claim, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, but the new battle for Western culture is being fought through birth rates and values, what specific actions must Western governments take beyond just immigration policy to preserve their own foundational principles? And is it already too late?